Senator Laird, what was your experience of the AIDS crisis like?
Well, you know, in some ways, I'm the son of a World War II veteran who would never talk about the war. And I realized recently that there's a lot of that it was so intense. And I lost so many friends, as did all of us. And I was right in the thick of it, that I hadn't talked about it extensively. And it was interesting because the one social thing I do in Sacramento is I play in a trivia group at a local gay bar with a team that everyone else is a generation younger than me. They're legislative staffers. And one time, a few years ago, there was a movie about the AIDS crisis in New York, and they said, let's all go see it. So we go see it, and then we go out to dinner afterwards, and to them it was like the Civil War. It was not something that they had all lived through. And they asked, did that really happen? Was it really like that? And as I start to talk about it a lot throughout the community, which I have in the last few years, it's intense. And I think it's really good for people to learn from it. And it's really good for people to know what happened right here in Santa Cruz County.
What happened right here in Santa Cruz County?
Well, there were interesting things. I mean, to begin with, when we all first understood this was going on, I remember there was one particular guy who was a adjunct faculty or had some teaching role at UCSC, who was the first one that we all seemed to know who got sick. And at the time, the LGBT social life in Santa Cruz was really around the bars. And one night he came into the Blue Lagoon and was just sort of tripping over every chair on the way in. It was one of the last times I saw him. And we were all trying to come to grips with what it was and what an appropriate response was. And I had to dig it out, and now I can't find it, but I was on the city council. I was elected in 1981. And in the spring of 1983, I introduced a resolution at the city council to advocate for more funding for education and research on AIDS. And we started to advocate. We started to figure out what to do, because in that period, there was lots of ignorance. And in fact, there was somebody in the mid-1980s that was fired from their job in Santa Cruz because they wouldn't stop volunteering with somebody that had HIV. And so as a city council member, I actually introduced an ordinance for non-discrimination on the basis of HIV, so that something like that couldn't happen again. It's just hard to believe that was true and that happened. And at the time, the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, wouldn't talk about it. And there was even joking about it at a press conference of the White House press secretary. And so people really felt alone, but that's what led to the Santa Cruz AIDS Project and other actions, is the need to organize and do our best to take some control of the situation.
Can you tell me about your time with the Santa Cruz AIDS Project?
Well, it was started by 6 of us, and interestingly, given the rap on activists at the beginning that it was white gay men, it was 6 gay men, but it was 3 white gay men and 3 men of color were the 6 that started the AIDS Project. And it was really trying to figure out what we could do. And everybody that was there among the 6, Wesley Harris, Ray Martinez, Gerald Landers, Sean Wharton, Jerry Solomon, and myself brought something different to it. Jerry was a therapist, and he was seeing a lot of people with HIV. Sean had been trained at Shanti to volunteer with people that were sick. The other 3 actually had HIV and brought a certain thing to it, but Gerald had worked for Dominican Hospital and brought medical stuff to it. And everybody had something that they brought to the table. And we actually had a community organizing meeting at Loudon Nelson where we tried to figure out what to do and try to get people involved. And it was great because there were people from the Santa Cruz Health Department that were there and that were in that were in at the beginning in many ways. As much as some governments didn't respond, different pieces of our local government were there at this crisis time. And then we just went from there.
And at some point you were the executive director.
Yes, I was term limited off the city council at the end of November 1990. And a couple of months later, after Joe Kenny resigned, I got hired as executive director and was executive director in the early 1990s. And it was a very difficult time because the drug cocktail didn't come until the mid-1990s. And so we were losing people regularly. But by then it was this unbelievable mobilization. We had $1 million budget a year, which at that time was a lot of money. It was overwhelmingly raised from the community. We had 600 regular volunteers, and some of them volunteered in different groups. There were volunteer educators to tell the story. There were volunteer care workers that had a client and would take somebody and would support them, practical support. There were people that were massage therapists that volunteered. There were therapists that volunteered. There were people that volunteered with a food pantry. There were people that volunteered with transportation. I mean, the community stepped up big time.
What was the climate of the time like here in Santa Cruz?
I think it's good to back up for a second and talk about Santa Cruz and the country. I was elected to the Santa Cruz City Council in 1981 and mayor in 1983, and I was one of the first 3 openly gay mayors in the United States. And all 3 of us were elected in 1983. And all 3 of us were from beach towns. I don't understand it. It was Santa Cruz, Laguna Beach, and Key West. And yet, when I was elected in 1981, there couldn't have been more than 8 or 10 out LGBT elected officials in the entire United States. When we formed the elected officials organization in 1985, we had just 15 members. And that's not totally representative because 3 were from West Hollywood, 3 were from the Twin Cities, 3 were from Madison, Wisconsin, 2 from San Francisco, and then the rest of us scattered around different places. And so it was still considered uphill to be openly gay. And at that time in Santa Cruz, there were many, many people that thought I was the only gay person they knew. It's hard to even describe it. There was a time in one of the first parades I marched, it had to be 1979 or 1978, and I worked for the county. And the chair of the Seniors Commission was sitting with the staff of the Seniors Commission at the Cooper House, and I marched by, and he said to him, "Did you see who was there?" And talked about me, and he didn't know the person that he was talking to was gay. And so there was just this whole level of closetedness that existed, and it was a time of real change. And it was exciting in one way. Overwhelmingly, polls showed that people didn't support LGBT rights. But when you looked under the polling results, those that said they knew somebody that was gay, it was a majority supported gay rights. And so the real issue is that coming out was a political statement, and coming out was really making the difference. And that was the background of the whole AIDS crisis, because there was still such a stigma with being gay, and it got attached immediately to the AIDS crisis. that was tough to overcome.
Do you feel like people were, coming out and then once being diagnosed with HIV, it was almost like going back in the closet because it was something that a lot of people couldn't share?
That's a real mixed issue because it was assumed if you were diagnosed with HIV that you were gay. And so it was hard to go back into the closet. And there were still these horrible things that were happening. There were still these horrible things that were happening. There were not visitation rights in hospitals. And so estranged families would come into town and prevent the partner from visiting in the last days of somebody's life. Or rights were not recognized because relationships were not recognized. And a family would be estranged and then half a house would be left to them. And it would be this horrible, horrible situation. And it's hard to remember that the lack of just basic family rights or civil rights was at the heart of a lot of issues with HIV.
I'd like to show you something. On this. Can you tell me what this is?
This is the Lavender Reader from the fall of 1988. And I'm sure you're getting it from other interviews, but the Lavender Reader by Scotty Brookie and then Joe Kenny was really published quarterly for a number of years and was really the gay publication in our area.
Mm-hmm. Would you mind reading that excerpt right there?
And I should say that I think I had a column in every single Lavender Reader, and it is really a statement of the times. And so what's marked here in one of my columns is, as always, the real message is to continue to organize, continue to press for our issues, and continue to make it very difficult for candidates to ignore us politically.
What are your thoughts on that now?
Well, that was very right. And I think it was important to press candidates. And it really made a difference. We actually organized, I think we called it then, a lesbian and gay caucus of the Democratic Party at the national conventions. And the first time I got together with any out elected officials nationally was at the 1984 Democratic Convention in San Francisco, and we did it informally. We formed the official group the next year. And then after that, we had caucuses that would always take positions on candidates or try to have candidates come and speak and make sure that everybody knew there was a presence. And part of our argument is that it's very hard for us to go home and argue for a ticket if the ticket isn't something worth arguing for. Mm-hmm. And it has changed so much in recent years that it's hard to remember when that was the case. Now the caucus at a convention is hundreds and hundreds of people.
What do you wish people born after the AIDS crisis knew about it?
Oh, that is such a good question. Because the thing about it is it was just gut-wrenching in so many ways. At the beginning, and actually through a lot of it, it was ignored by people in the highest positions of power. And I'm convinced that if dollars had been put into research much earlier, the drug cocktail probably could have come much earlier and lives would have been saved. And I think it's also good to know that there's this generation, primarily of men, but there were women and that we lost. And, recently I did a taping of political show in Sacramento. I did a taping of a political show in Sacramento, and I got asked about this, and we went into it in a way that it was really emotional. And they said, why is it that out women got to the legislature before out men? Sheila Kuehl in 1994, 1996, Carol Migden, Jackie Goldberg, and Chris Kehoe in 2000. And it wasn't until Mark Leno and I got there in 2002 that men were there. And I said, it's two reasons. One is these were unbelievably competent women. They were really stars, and they deserve to be the trailblazers that they have been. But the other reason is some of the people that would have been the first men in the legislature died in the epidemic. And I named them. I mean, Bill Krause in San Francisco, who was an assistant to Harvey Milk, Frank Cook in Long Beach, Neil Good in San Diego, Stan Haddon, who was in Sacramento, and there were many, many more. And one or two of them would have likely been there along with Sheila Kuehl in the earliest thing. And it is hard to acknowledge that. And the other thing is that I didn't realize how deep-seated the emotion is with me. And so I was in the assembly, and I was invited to do this reading for the debate club at Sacramento State, and they were doing a reading on Howard Zinn as a fundraiser. And they said, we have a thing for you to read, and it was a Vito Rousseau article from about 1988. And Vito Rousseau wrote The Celluloid Closet. He came to Santa Cruz. He taught here for a quarter. I got to know him. He died in the epidemic. And so I read this, and I was just shocked because I was partway through it, and I could barely continue with every word. My voice was cracking. And I struggled, and I struggled, and I finally got to the end. And the crowd cheered for about 2 minutes, and I was like, leave me alone. Just leave me alone. It's like, I feel like I just opened myself out. And part of it is that the New York Times, on multiple occasions at that time, said, don't worry, AIDS hasn't reached the general population. And Vito Rousseau wrote like, well, what are we, chopped liver? And was really powerful in his response. And I think that one of the things is it was such a period of sadness and loss, but it was also a period where it brought out the finest things in many, many people. And in the 1970s and into the 80s, and some people will argue to this date, there was a high level of misogyny among gay men. And there was this, to say gay men and lesbians was a stretch because there wasn't this mutual working relationship or maybe in some cases understanding or respect. And yet in Santa Cruz, the women stepped up. If you looked at our volunteers, it was the women that really stepped up to help the sick men when it was going on. And in defense of the men, some of them were sick, some of them were losing really close friends and were dealing with it, and some of them just couldn't deal with it. And it is, I think that if you look at a time that the cleavage between men and women was really narrowed in the LGBT community in Santa Cruz, it was because of the AIDS crisis.
John, do you want to tell me about your pin?
Yes, I brought a button because it was basically look for memorabilia. And this pin is "Silence equals death." And it was really the slogan of ACT UP at the time. And it was that if we didn't push this and we didn't speak up, we were going to be subject to whatever happened. And obviously, leadership of the country was not speaking up, so we had to. And so there were T-shirts, there were buttons. This was the center phrase one time when the Golden Gate Bridge was blocked in rush hour by ACT UP, which at first I was like, oh no. And yet, as angry as people were, it led to people calling and saying, what can we do? It actually, for those of us that were working on it, a little more, you could say, on the inside, that outside agitation actually empowered us in a way that we could get resources to deal with the crisis.
Did ACT UP's tactics influence organizing in Santa Cruz?
I think ACT UP did influence organizing in Santa Cruz. The difference is we're a smaller town where most people know each other in a way that you weren't in a metropolitan area of millions and millions of people. You would have worked on people's campaigns. You'd be their neighbor. You'd be their friend. You would work with them in a way that there were ways to influence people that were really different.
You lost a lot of friends and community members, and you described that time as intense, among other things. What motivated you to do this work?
I think it was a mix of things. It was like, if not me, who? And there weren't people necessarily from the political realm. And I had contacts with our member of Congress, our state legislators, in a way that people would return my phone calls. And yet, I felt helpless with people all around me getting sick and what was happening, and wanted to do whatever I could. And I think it's interesting because I am now at the point that I'm much near the end of my career. And if I look back, and it's a storied career for me in many different levels of government, my period of time working on the HIV crisis was one of the most meaningful things that I've done in my life. I mean, I took a massive pay cut, and yet it was everybody bringing whatever skill they had to the table. And I had some unique skills, and there was no way we could sit by and not act while this was happening.
Why did you take over as executive director at SCAP?
I really felt at SCAP I had unique things to bring. If you look at the executive director, and SCAP has really been fortunate. Gerald Landers is the first, Joe Kenny, John Leopold. There were some incredible executive directors of SCAP, and if you're looking at what it takes some fundraising ability, it takes management ability, it takes street cred in the community, it takes the ability to have compassion and understand what's going on. And many times I see that those skills don't come together completely in an executive director. And SCAP was lucky because they came together for many of the early executive directors, and it's something that I could bring. And Joe Kenny had done a great job, and I just wanted to take it to the next level.
How did doing this work within HIV and AIDS change you as a person?
I think it's fair to say that we all are young, and I don't know if I want to go so far as to say narcissistic, but we are just caught up in our own lives. And this, and to a little extent the earthquake that happened in Santa Cruz while I was on the city council, forced me to deal with things that I might have in another time or place in my life sought to avoid. And there were times in the epidemic that I said, I am never going to another funeral. And then I would be at the next funeral. And because that person was as important as the previous one and the next one. And I think that's the thing, is it was just so important to be involved and do things, and it was so important to try to impact it at the time it happened.
How do you think Santa Cruz would be different if we hadn't lost all those people to AIDS?
You know, it's interesting because I know in the course of this, you're going to be interviewing Terry Kavanaugh, who was actually the first employee of the AIDS Project. Terry was the first employee before there was even an executive director. And his boyfriend was Gary Reynolds, who, in one of the most stirring moments of the epidemic, was the grand marshal of the parade and sat in the park and watched the program and died that night. And Terry said to me later, Gary was frustrating to me periodically because he was just one of the strongest activists politically unrelated to HIV. And I said to Terry once, I really look forward to seeing him in 10 or 20 years when he has a little more life experience and he realizes that things aren't as clear-cut as he sees them. And I hope he brings the same passion to it when that happens. And Terry told me later, I couldn't tell you that I knew that he'd been diagnosed with HIV and I wasn't sure that he was going to live to be the person that you were looking forward to seeing. And I just think of all the individuals and how everyone was a Gary, and cumulatively, we would have so much richness in the community that we lost during that. I mean, we lost teachers, letter carriers, physicians, just amazing groups of people that were trailblazers in their own right and that were changing people's lives and who were making this meaningful contribution to the community, and they were just gone. And I think periodically, at the time when there were so few out-elected officials in the United States, when I was a state cabinet member and when I'm a member of the state senate, I think of some of my friends and, oh, they would have loved this. You know, they would have had so much to say. They would be in my ear all the time. And that is sometimes that I just think of the loss.
Thank you. We'll take a break. Do you see any modern parallels to the AIDS crisis?
There have been a few. I have to say that at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when people said, we've had nothing like this, it was really irritating. And it's like, you want to hear about what we've had before? And it just felt like marginalization again. But the brief scare that we had over monkeypox, that was a couple of years ago, was very analogous in some ways because it was disproportionately hitting the gay community. And I agreed to serve on an emergency select committee on monkeypox. And right beforehand, a health officer in a county in my district said, don't worry, it hasn't reached the general population yet. And so at that first hearing, I exploded. I really said, that is what was said during HIV, and that is what's being said now. And it's outrageous. It creates different classes of citizens. It doesn't affect the chance that this actually could spread wildly regardless. And that is just caveman thinking. And it seemed very analogous to where we were in the HIV crisis.
Given the rise in anti-trans legislation and anti-LGBTQ bills around the country, do you see any parallels to that in the political climate of the AIDS crisis?
as we tape this, the governor just signed a bill that we did to not require forced outing of trans kids, but any LGBT kids, by teachers in schools. And it was really interesting because it just brought back the forced outing that people wanted to do in different ways during the HIV crisis and just general LGBT rights in the 1980s. It is very similar. And I think some of us could speak in various hearings with a voice of experience in a way that I love my parents. They were very accepting and loving over time as I came out. But if I had been in high school, I wouldn't have wanted a teacher to be the one to tell them. This was all about our relationship and us feeling enough trust, and it was the right time to do it. And there's a history of people being thrown out by their families when this happens. And it seems to me that the current issues about trans kids are really analogous to those issues of gay kids 30 and 40 years ago.
What activism were you aware of or involved in during the AIDS crisis?
The activism in the AIDS crisis took such a broad reach. It was about being public. It was about within governments. It was about street level demonstrations. It was many different things. And I obviously was involved in the electoral part. And I obviously was involved in the governmental part. And I did my part in some of the street level activism because I wanted to make sure I was just another voice in ensuring that this was addressed in some ways. And I think it was a good message because if you feel powerless, the old phrase is don't mourn, organize. And that's what we did, whether it was to organize SCAP or to do public things. And I think the lesson is some of the organizing was very successful. Some of the first research breakthroughs were done because of money that we leveraged in the state budget as elected officials and activists in the mid-1980s. We had then Speaker Willie Brown take it seriously. We had a meeting. They managed to get some money in. There were some good results from it. And so I think that it was the message that that's a key part, as well as keeping it in front of the public at every point.
Is there anything else that you would like to add before we wrap?
I think that one of the interesting things of the crisis was that it brought out the best in so many people that did not know this was an issue for them. And I remember going to a funeral at a church on the east side, and there was a local animal services officer. He was a friend of mine, and he died. And he had been raised locally. And he went back to this church and said, I was raised in this church, and if you always said, if I needed you, you would be there. And I've been diagnosed with HIV, and I need you. And people got up at that funeral from the congregation and basically said things like, I didn't think this was my issue. I didn't know there were people here. I didn't feel like I was involved in this. And one by one, they got involved, and that church rallied for him. And it was very touching for the members of the congregation to speak at the memorial about how he had changed them and this experience had changed them. And so as much as we look back and miss everybody that should be here, there was some profound change and there was some good that happened in ways that I don't think we thought was possible when we started organizing.